Gathered at the house of the town's father and benefactor, the police chief, the officials had the opportunity to remark to one another that they were looking rather drawn as a result of all this worry and bother. Indeed, the appointment of the new Governor General, the two very grave communications, and the incredible rumors circulating, all this had left a clear imprint on every face. And the frock coats of many of them looked rather loose. They were all run down. The president of the district court had lost weight. The health inspector had lost weight. The public prosecutor had lost weight. One Semyon Ivanovich something or other, whose last name no one ever mentioned, and who wore a ring on his index finger, which he liked to show to the ladies, had also lost weight. Of course, there were among them some fearless men, such as are usually to be found, whose spirit never deserted them. They were, however, few in number. In fact, there was only the postmaster. He never changed, never lost his composure, and said what he usually said on such occasions. I've seen governors general before. I've seen 3 or 4 of them come and go in my time, and here I am. Been sitting pretty tight for over 30 years. To this the others usually replied, It's all very well for you to talk, Sprechen Sie Deutsch, Ivan Andreevich. You're in the mail business, and all you have to do is receive and dispatch the mail. What opportunity have you for cheating? Closing down an hour earlier? Overcharging some merchant for accepting a letter at a late hour? Or maybe sending off some parcel that shouldn't be dispatched? With no more temptation than that, anyone could be a saint. But how'd you feel if the devil himself walked in every day and insisted that you accept a little present, pushed it in your hand, in fact, and then you really haven't much to worry about. You only have one son. But I have my Praskovia, who's so damn prolific that every year she produces another little Praski or a new Petey. If you had to face that, brother, you'd talk differently. That's what the officials said. Now, whether it's possible to resist the devil's own temptations or not, that's none of my business. At the meeting underway, there was precious little of the stuff that the common people call horse sense. In general, our people are not too successful with representative institutions. In all our assemblies, from Peasants' Council, the Mir, to all sorts of learned and other committees, there is always great confusion unless someone is found to direct the proceedings. It's hard to explain why, but the meetings and assemblies at which we're most successful are those convened for the purpose of drinking. And yet there are people ready for anything at any time, charitable, philanthropic, and God knows what societies are apt to crop up with every change in the wind. The purpose may be magnificent, but nothing comes of it. Perhaps it's because we feel satisfied from the very outset and think our objective has already been achieved. Thus, having formed, say, a philanthropic organization for the benefit of the poor and having raised considerable funds for that purpose, we immediately organize a big dinner for the high dignitaries in celebration of our praiseworthy initiative, thus spending half the contributions collected. Then we rent a luxurious office suite for the committee, with heating, watchmen, porters, and all, after which there are 5 rubles 50 left for the poor. And even then, the committee members can't reach an agreement on where the sums to go, for everyone has some relative in mind. But after all, the assembly we are presently concerned with was of a quite different character. It had been formed in an emergency. It was not concerned with poor beggars or any such outsiders. Its business concerned each official directly and personally. They were here to try and cope with the threat hanging over everyone present. So, willy-nilly, they had to achieve unanimity. Yet, despite all this, they made a mess of it, without even mentioning the differences of opinion which are common to all meetings. The participants displayed a rather bewildering lack of determination. One contended that Chichikov was a counterfeiter. And after a pause, added that perhaps he was no counterfeiter after all? Another one said he was an agent from the Governor General's office, remarking, however, that such things are not usually written all over a man's face, and that therefore he was damned if he knew. Everyone rejected the idea that he was a disguised bandit because, besides his respectable appearance, there was nothing in his way of expressing himself that would suggest a man of violent inclination. The postmaster, who had remained plunged in deep thought for several minutes, because he had been struck by a sudden inspiration or by something else, suddenly exclaimed, "You know who he is, gentlemen?" His voice had something so impressive about it that everyone present felt obliged to shout, "Who?" "He's none other than Captain Kopeikin, gentlemen." The others declared that they had no idea who Captain Kopeikin was. "Captain Kopeikin," the postmaster said, opening his snuff box only halfway lest one of his neighbors should thrust his fingers into it. The postmaster was skeptical about the cleanliness of his neighbor's fingers and was in the habit of saying, "Remember, friend, you put your fingers into places I wouldn't care to mention, while tobacco is a thing requiring cleanliness." The postmaster took a pinch of snuff and repeated, "Captain Kopeikin, yes," he said. "His story would provide a writer with an absorbing subject, a poem of sorts, if I may say so." Everyone present expressed his desire to hear the story, or, as the postmaster had called it, the, quote, "poem of sorts," end of quote. The story of Captain Kopeikin. "After the 1812 campaign, my good sir," the postmaster began, although there were a whole 6 good sirs in the room rather than one. "Captain Kopeikin was one of the wounded who were repatriated. I cannot say where it happened, at Krasny or at Leipzig, but imagine, he'd lost both an arm and a leg." Well, you realize, of course, that at that time they hadn't any arrangements, to take care of the disabled. These, what you might call funds for the wounded, came much later, you see. So this Captain Kopeikin realized he had to get out and look for work, but then, you see, his good hand was the left one. He went to see his father, and the father says to him, "I can't feed you." Can you imagine that? "I find it hard," the father says to him, "to get enough to eat myself as it is." And so, my good sir, this Captain Kopeikin decides to go to Petersburg to petition the Tsar for some imperial dispensation, to say something like, "Here I am, such and such, and I have sacrificed my life and, so to speak, spilled my blood." Well, somehow, by getting lifts on army wagons and carts, he managed to get to Petersburg. Now, just imagine, what happens when a fellow like this Captain Kopeikin finds himself in a capital which has, so to speak, no equal in the world? Suddenly he sees a lot of bright lights, as if he were gazing upon, as it were, a living sea or some fabulous Scheherazade. Imagine it for yourself. He suddenly sees, say, Nevsky Avenue, or maybe Gorokovaya Street, or, damn it, Litania Street, with that spire way up there in the air, and then there are those bridges hanging God knows how without any support. See what I mean? In other words, a real Babylon, my good sir. There's no denying it. He went around looking for a place to stay, but the prices were wicked, something frightening, with those curtains, blinds, all sorts of junk, Persian rugs and all that. In short, it was like swimming in wealth. And you could smell rubles. Thousands of them. Just walking around in the streets. And mind you, this Captain Kopeikin has on him perhaps 10 5-ruble notes at best. In the end, he managed to get a room in a tavern for a ruble a day, including a dinner of cabbage soup and chopped beef. He realized he couldn't waste much time. He started making inquiries about where to apply for a job and was told that there was a sort of Supreme Commission, a sort of administrative office, see? And it was run by someone with ministerial rank. And I must mention that the Tsar was not yet back in the capital at the time. Our troops were still in Paris, and everything, as you can imagine, was still abroad. So my Kopeikin got up early, scraped some stubble off his physiognomy with his left hand, for he couldn't afford a barber, pulled on his threadbare coat, and stumping along on his piece of wood, went to see the minister in person. When he asked directions, they pointed out a house on the Palace Quay. Some peasant shack for you. The window panes at least 12 feet wide, shining like mirrors, but so transparent, everything inside, such as vases and all, could be seen so clearly that, in a way, you got the impression you could have stretched your arm out and grabbed them right from the street. Oh, you should have seen it. The expensive marble the walls were made of inside, and metal hardware all over the place, such as the doorknobs, for instance. Well, you'd rush to the corner store, get yourself a kopek's worth of soap, and scrub your hands for a couple of hours or so before you'd even dare touch that handle. In a word, such shine and polish that, in a way, you'd get dizzy. Even the doorman looked like a generalissimo, gilt mace, the face of a count, like a well-fed pug dog, and wearing a dazzling white collar with all the trimmings. So, our Kopeikin scraped his courage together, stumped on his peg leg into the waiting room, and huddled in a corner there so as to stay clear of some marvel from America or India. One of those gilt porcelain vase things. Well, of course, he had time to stand there to his heart's content because, as you can well imagine, he had arrived at an hour when the minister had, so to speak, hardly got out of bed, and his valet had maybe just brought in a silver basin for all sorts of ablutions, Now, when Kopeikin had been waiting for just about 4 hours, out comes an adjutant, or whoever was on duty, and announces that the minister is about to come out to the waiting room. And in the waiting room, there are as many people as there are beans in a bowl full. And these folk are no rank-and-file officials like us. They're mostly civil service officers of the rank of colonel at least, and here and there you might even find a general. The company is as high as they come, if you see what I mean. And then suddenly a barely perceptible flutter passes through the waiting room like a sort of light breeze or something. A shh comes from one place and another, and then there's silence, a frightening silence. Then in comes the big chief. Well, you can see it from here. A statesman. And his expression, well, in accordance with his rank, you can well imagine the kind of expression. And so everyone there in the waiting room is up on his feet, standing stiffly to attention, waiting, trembling, expecting, so to speak, his fate to be settled. And the big man approaches one or the other and asks, "What do you want here? What is it? State your business." And finally, my good sir, he comes to Kopeikin, and Kopeikin gathers up all his courage and says to him, "Here's how it is, Your Excellency. I've shed my blood for my country and have lost an arm and a leg and am incapacitated for work and am petitioning for some imperial kindness or assistance, so to speak." The minister can see that the man is standing on a peg leg and that the empty right sleeve is pinned to the coat and says, "All right, come back in the next few days." Kopeikin leaves almost crazy with joy, if only because he's been received by a minister of the, so to speak, highest rank, and then also he thinks that now he'll be told the decision about what actually could be a pension of sorts. He is in such a happy mood. Imagine, he's actually skipping as he walks along. He dropped into Palkin's Inn for a glass of vodka, had dinner in the London restaurant, where he ordered himself a cutlet with caper sauce, a chicken with all sorts of trimmings, and drank a bottle of wine. Then he went to the theater. In brief, he had a little spree of it. Then he sees a tall, slender English woman walking along the sidewalk, like some swan, that sort of thing. So my Kopeikin's blood stirred, and he started running after her on his piece of wood. Bang, pa-ta, bang, bang. But then he decided, no, not today, later. When I get my pension, I've done enough today as it is. And so after some 3 or 4 days, Kopeikin goes back to the minister and waits for him to appear in the waiting room. When the minister arrives, he says, I am such, and I have come, he says, to hear the decree issued by your excellency concerning my disability and my wounds, and all that sort of thing in the proper official terms. And just imagine, the big man recognized him immediately. Ah, he says to Kopeikin. Very well, he says. This time I can't tell you anything except that you must wait until the Tsar returns home. Then, no doubt, dispositions concerning disabled veterans will be made. But I can do nothing without the, so to speak, imperial command. And in the meantime, greetings and farewell. You understand. Now, as you can imagine, Kopeikin left with rather mixed feelings. He had been hoping that maybe tomorrow they were going to start giving him his pension. Here, pal, have yourself a good time, or something like that. And now he had to wait, and he hadn't even been told how long a wait at that. So he left the ministers looking like an owl or a poodle on the receiving end of a cook's bucket of water. Tail between his legs, ears hanging, all that. No, it can't be like that, he says to himself. I'll have to go once more and make them understand that I'm down to my last mouthful, and if they don't help me, I'm sure, in a way, to starve to death. And so briefly he returns to the Palace Quay, where they tell him, impossible, no audiences today, come tomorrow. The next day it's the same thing. The doorman refuses even to look at him, and by now he's on his last banknote. He no longer eats cabbage soup and beef, but goes to a store and gets himself a herring, a pickled cucumber, and 2 kopecks worth of bread. And with this, his appetite turns really ravenous. And sometimes he has to pass by a restaurant where there's a foreign cook, if you can imagine, a Frenchman, with a friendly-looking face, with Holland linen on him, with a snow-white apron, preparing fine herbs or cutlets with truffles or some other delicatesse, which makes Kopeikin's appetite so keen that he would have eaten himself if he could have. Also, he sometimes walks past one of those expensive stores, and there in the window is a sturgeon looking out at the street, and cherries at 5 rubles apiece, and a huge watermelon the size of a stagecoach, exhibiting itself as if it is looking for the fool that's willing to pay 100 rubles for it. In brief, he comes up against so many temptations every step, he takes that his mouth waters, but all he hears all the time is tomorrow, tomorrow, and nothing else. Finally, the poor man feels somehow that he can't stand it any longer, so he decides to storm the place if he has to, you understand? He waits outside for another petitioner to enter and manages to slip into the waiting room behind some general or other. As usual, the minister comes out, but he catches sight of Kopeikin and says, "Why are you here? Why?" he says to him. "I told you, didn't I? You must wait for the Tsar's decision. But please understand, Your Excellency, I am without a piece of bread, so to speak." "Well, what am I supposed to do about that?" "Try in the meantime to help yourself. Find some means of subsistence." "But, Your Excellency, you must realize that I can't find any means of subsistence when I'm missing an arm and a leg." "But," the minister says to him, You must understand that I can't support you personally, so to speak. There are many wounded war veterans, and they all have an equal claim to a pension. You must arm yourself with patience. Wait for the Tsar to come back, and I give you my word that he won't forget you. But I can't wait, Your Excellency, Kopeikin says, and goes on to say some quite rude things. So you see, the minister begins to resent his behavior. Indeed, judge for yourself. All around there are important people waiting, we may say, for decisions of national importance, matters that need to be attended to urgently, in which every minute counts. And here's this nagging fool sticking like a leech. Excuse me, the minister says. I must attend to business that is more important than yours. In other words, he gives Kopeikin a subtle hint that it might be the right time for him to get out. But Kopeikin, hunger seems to have driven him on. Do what you like, Your Excellency, he declared, but I won't leave until you've produced the order. Well, what do you think of that? Answering like that to a minister who has only to make a little sign and you go flying out upside down, and the devil himself will never find your remains? You know what happens when an official only one rank lower than you says something rude to you, and here there's not one rank, but an abyss between the two of them. A minister and some obscure captain, it's like 90 rubles compared to 0. And so the minister said nothing more, just looked at Kopeikin, and his eyes were like firearms. There was no soul left in his look. But the captain, believe it or not, doesn't budge. He just stands there, as if he's dug into the ground. What do you mean? The minister said finally, as if he decided to teach Kopeikin a good lesson. But to tell the truth, he wasn't too hard on him. Another in his place could have given him such a fright that the street itself would have turned head over heels for days afterward. But this minister only said, all right, he says. If you think it's too expensive for you to wait here for the decision, I'll put you somewhere, he says, at government expense. Call the guard, he says, and let him show this fellow his new quarters. And then there's the guard standing there, a 7-footer with huge hands that nature seemed to have created especially, in a word, an absolute dentist. And so they grabbed my poor Kopeikin, God's own poor creature, and shoved him into a cart with the guard. Well, Kopeikin thinks, at least I don't have to pay my traveling expenses, thanks even for this. And so he is driven along by the guard, and while being driven along, reasons with himself as follows. So the minister says I should find myself some means of subsistence. Fine, then, he says under his breath. I'll find some means of subsistence. Well, how he was delivered to his destination and where that was is altogether unknown. Thus, you see, the rumors about Captain Kopeikin were drowned in the Lethe, as the poets say, which Lethe is the river of forgetfulness. But wait a minute, gentlemen. It is just at this point that the plot of the novel begins. So, we don't know where Kopeikin disappeared, but believe it or not, before 2 months had elapsed, a gang of robbers appeared in the forests around Ryazan. And the chief of the gang was none other than... But just a moment, Ivan Andreevich, the police chief interposed suddenly. You've told us yourself that your Kopeikin had an arm and a leg missing, while Chichikov... At this point, the postmaster let out an exclamation and slapped himself on the forehead, publicly, in front of everyone, calling himself, quote, a piece of veal, end of quote. He couldn't understand how this fact had failed to occur to him at the start of his story, and admitted that that saying about hindsight being a Russian's strongest point had something to it. A minute later, however, he was trying to get around the difficulty by asserting that, after all, in England, they had very advanced techniques. It was in the newspapers. and that somebody had invented wooden legs constructed in a way that pressure on an inconspicuous spring could carry a man so far that he could never be found again.